This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought, and to debate. Brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm Dalia Shenlin, and tragically, Gilad is not with us today. But in general, we'll be talking every week about books and research and things that have caught our attention. If you like what we do, please consider donating to us by going to our Tel Aviv Review website, where you'll find our Patreon campaign. My guest this week is Dr. Ronen Bergman. I don't want to brag. Israel's foremost security and defense reporter, I think it's fair to say. He's a senior correspondent for military and intelligence affairs for Yediot Ahronot, a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine, and the author of 5 best-selling Hebrew-language nonfiction books. He is the recipient of a ton of prizes. And in a classic culmination for the Tel Aviv Review, he also holds a law degree. He completed a master's and a PhD at Cambridge University. And we'll be talking about his latest book called Rise and Kill First. It has just been published by Penguin Random House Books literally minutes ago. And if you read it, you will devour all 600 pages in minutes. Dr. Ronen Bergman, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure. The reason why the book is so compelling is because it addresses one of the most sensitive stories in all of Israel's history, targeted assassinations. Why did Israel do so many of them? What do they mean for Israel? And what do they mean for its conflicts? I want to start by asking you about this remarkable observation that you make in the beginning of the book, that since World War II, Israel has executed more targeted killings than any other Western country. I calculated from your figures 2,300. I think you tally before and after the Second Intifada. I don't have figures for the other countries, but it sounds like a lot to me. Why so many? Israel's a small country. We're not the only country in conflict.
I think it's a combination of a few things. First and foremost, the lessons of the Holocaust. And if I want to point 3 of them, that the new Israelis, those who established the Zionist movement and then the State of Israel, these 3 lessons. First is that there will always be a goy, a Gentile, that's going to be after us, trying to annihilate us. Second, that the rest of the goyim, the Gentiles, are going to stand aside, if not help the first one. And the third lesson is that we need to have a safe haven, a homeland, and protect it at all cost. Now, when every generation, every era, every decade, your prime adversary, your main enemy, is compared to Hitler, true or not, and this is the Israeli mindset, whether it was President Nasser, or Saddam Hussein of Iraq, Yasser Arafat of the PLO, or Mohammad Ahmadinejad from Iran, they were all compared to Hitler. When your prime adversary is Hitler, and you have all these lessons at the back of your mind, you will spare no means, and you will attribute, I would say, a lesser importance to international law and international norms. This is one thing. The second main pillar that created or made Israel the country that used targeted killings and assassinations more than any other country in the Western world after the Second World War is that from day one, Israeli leaders understood that they cannot prolong or have long wars. They cannot have the whole of the Israeli army, based mainly on reserves, recruited and stationed on the border. They need to prolong the time between wars as much possible. And that can be done with great intelligence agencies, with good information about the adversary, and with pinpointed, focused, far beyond enemy lines operations, sabotage, and assassinations.
It's an amazing view of the entire history of the country. In a way, it's almost like the history of Zionism seen through the prism of targeted assassinations. Would you say you had some sort of a particular theme or message that you were trying to get across in this book?
I think you just said that. What I was trying to do is, and I think it's a little different than all the other books that has been written about Israeli intelligence and the Mossad so far. One of the things that is different is not to have a random series of operations, but to put all of them in the political, historical, social, geographic, and even economical context. And try to understand and try to convey that to the readers, that the unique character of the Jewish people and unique history and current unique threats of Israeli enemies created and a very different intelligence community than any other one in the world. Just imagine, Dalia, that the Magna Carta of Israeli intelligence, on one hand, they are doing sabotages and assassinations. On the other, they are dealing with refugees. They are bringing Jews from wrong countries. There's no other intelligence agency or intelligence community in the world that is dealing with refugees. It's dealt by someone else, if at all. Israeli intelligence is not just in charge of protecting citizens of Israel in Israel. They are in charge of protecting all Israelis, wherever they are, but they are in charge to protect all Jews. So what I'm trying to say, what I've been trying to write, is the history of Israeli intelligence, how the unique character of the Israeli people created that unique intelligence agencies and that community, secret community, how it, in its turn, secretly but profoundly changed Israeli history and the history of the region and sometimes the history of the world.
Well, there's so many issues this opens up. I mean, there are the moral issues, the legal issues, the political issues. But I want to start with just going through, the book is storytelling, right? You're telling all the stories of a great number of the assassinations.
Not all of them.
No, obviously not. You can't possibly do all of them.
No.
2,300 is a lot. But I want to ask you,
I am forbidden to do all of them.
Well, we're going to talk about the sensitivity of getting the information. But this may sound like a terrible question, but is there some sort of it kind of reflects a gory fascination. Can you talk about which stories in the book were the most striking to you, were the most surprising, or the ones that really made a big impression on you when you found out about them and wrote about them?
There are many. There were moments where I discovered stuff which made me very excited, amazed, shocked to the extent of the complexity, the grain of genius that is inherent inside Israeli intelligence operations and special thinking. There were times when I regret rediscovering stuff because it made me happy as a journalist and a historian because I have this new exciting story, but made me very sad as an Israeli.
Like what?
The time of Israeli involvement in Lebanon between, I would say, 1978, when Lieutenant General Rafael Eitan, Raful, was appointed Chief of Staff, and later joined by Ariel Sharon, who was appointed Minister of Defense in September 1981, until early 1983, when Raful Eitan just finished his term and was not fired because of his wrongdoing that led to the massacre in the Sabra and Shatila camps, and Ariel Sharon was forced to resign. This time, again, between 1978 to 1983, and what Israel has done in Lebanon is, I think, the greatest moral eclipse in the history of our country. And much was already published about that and told about that, but unfortunately, there's still much more to tell. And I hope that this book, these chapters 14 to 16, which some of these pages actually wrote with tears in my eyes. Long nights, writing the stuff, researching, going over the transcripts and the documents, and it really made me sad to think that Israelis were involved in that. However, I must say that this time is also a time of bravery, because there were brave soldiers and brave officers, some of them junior and some of them very high rank, that stood against the defense minister. You know, Ariel Sharon was very charismatic and very powerful. And when Begin got into depression, Ariel Sharon actually seized control over the executive branch. He declared mutiny against the people of Israel. And there were brave officers who stood against him and said, these things, these actions which endanger the life of innocent people, we are not going to do. Or in other cases, they made the operational circumstances difficult, so the operation just cannot be executed. And at the end of the day, we are talking about, as I said, a moral eclipse which derives mainly from the characters of two people, Rafael Eitan and Ariel Sharon, but also of a great victory of brave people who, with their actions, made sure that we are not all stained with awful war crimes and atrocities. I go back to your question, why I was surprised. First, I didn't know about much of that. Nobody knew. Some of them are like the dark secrets of the Air Force and the Israeli military intelligence, etc. Second, I think that the extent of endangering innocent lives was vast during the war. And of course, there is a question that is weaved through the pages, that what does democracy permit itself to do to defend the state and its civilians and its citizens, even if these actions violate other human democratic values, like the right to live?
Right, and I think that tension sort of runs throughout the book, and there's sort of a question of the balance informs the decision-making at the moment and sometimes of the legal authorities of the country.
Yeah, you asked me about, I would say that there were other moments which I remember. One of them was reading the Mossad protocols and documents of what is termed in Mossad as the vitamin C affair, which is this whole conduct against the German scientist who used to work in Peenemünde for the Gestapo, and then after the war in the early 60s went to work for Nasser in Egypt. Now, in that long affair, which we can compare to the Israeli fight against the Iranian nuclear project, because at that time, in the 60s, Mossad was caught completely surprised. They didn't know that these Germans are going to Egypt and that they are building rockets for Nasser. And only did they learn when Nasser took them out in the annual parade for the Revolution Day and then tested them and said, these missiles are going to hit any point south to Beirut. And
who would that be?
Who would that be? And then the Egyptian radio, the voice of thunder from Cairo, said, with these missiles, we are going to destroy Al-Hay'a As-Sahiyuniyya, which means the Zionist entity. They didn't say Israel. They say either the Zionist enemy or the Zionist entity. Now, the Israelis, at that time, 1962, where Israel was full with Holocaust survivors, when they learned that this new Hitler is using German scientists who used to work for the old one, the old Hitler, in a Gestapo-run factory in Peenemünde, and they built the V1 and V2 that targeted London and Antwerpen, they were in hysteria. Mossad was in hysteria.
You explain it also as a major failure because this whole thing developed right under their noses, I think is how you put it.
Yeah, they chased Nazis because Israel, the chief of the Mossad at that time, he thought that the Nazis are going to build a new Germany or a new Wehrmacht or whatever, and they weren't. And the whole chase went to nowhere, except for the only thing where Nazis actually endangered Israel, they didn't know about that. And then Mossad went to a whole assassination campaign, which failed miserably and didn't deter the scientists from continuing because Nasser was offering them a lot of money. And what solved the problem after Ha'el was forced to step down and even Ben Gurion was forced to step down because of the political implication of that affair. What solved that? And this is one of the most amazing intelligence stories I've ever heard in the history of Israeli intelligence. The man who helped Israel more than anyone else to solve the problem was a new recruit to the Mossad. The man who was described by the British intelligence as the most dangerous man in Europe, Adolf Hitler's favorite, the commander of special operation for the SS, the commander of the SS battalion in Vienna and Kristallnacht, Otto Skorzeny. He was recruited to the Mossad. He knew that he is recruited to the Mossad because the Mossad could offer him something that no one else could. And in return for that something, he helped Mossad understand, have the reliable intelligence from inside the German project in Egypt, and then disassemble it without even one bullet being fired. Mossad offered him life without fear. They gave him a letter of immunity from Prime Minister Levi Eshkol and a new passport. And he could continue his life in Spain without fearing the same fate like Eichmann.
Or some of the other Nazis who were hunted down. Mm-hmm. You have a pretty gory chronicle of the targeted killing of the butcher of Riga, which I mention because it's a very grim story, and it also is an example of an almost failure. It's not a failure, but it's so botched that you say that the people who were involved had nightmares for the rest of their lives. And I was going to ask you, to what extent Are the people involved in this, happy wouldn't be the right word, but satisfied with what they're doing, or to what extent does it trouble them?
I must say that most of the people I spoke with that actually were in the intimate circle of performing an assassination, and not just assassination from a drone, but actually pulling the trigger, pressing the red button, triggering some sort of a booby trap car, etc.
Or spraying poison.
All these. They did not express any regrets, most of them. They were profoundly convinced that what they are doing is necessary for the preservation of the national security of Israel and saving Israeli and Jewish lives, and that these people are scumbags that should be killed. I can recall one quote that I have from Nehemia Meiri, who was the chief of Bayonet, Kidon, the assassination unit of the Mossad, and he was the one pulling the trigger in many of the Mossad assassination after the Munich Olympic terror attack. And he said, I have no problem with anyone that I've killed. They all deserved 2 bullets in the chest and 1 in the head. If I have something waking me up at night, and if I have someone coming to me in the nightmares, the members of the family that were killed near me in that ghetto in Poland, and the Muslims that I saw, and everything that I saw during the Second World War. But everything that I did after that, I have no problem. There is one exception that I can recall. And this is a guy who was running the intelligence collection part in the assassination operation against Khalil al-Wazir, Abu Jihad. He was killed by Sayeret Matkal, Israeli commando, in Tunis in 1988. And that guy, which I cannot name, but he was in charge of much of the precise intelligence collection in the immediate vicinity of Abu Jihad. And again, I cannot elaborate more why and how he could do that, but this is quite an amazing story. And he says, I do regret being involved in that. We miss Abu Jihad. We could have him with his charisma, his military background and prestige. We could have him by Arafat during the Oslo Accord, balancing him, not letting Arafat taking this sort of political, I would say, approach of supporting peace but also supporting terrorism at the same time. I ask for forgiveness from the memory of Abu Jihad and the members of his family. I asked Amnon Lipkin-Shahak, who was the chief of staff and the chief of military intelligence during that operation. I said, Amnon, maybe we shouldn't have killed Abu Jihad. And he said, Ronen, theoretically, the best thing we could do is raid his house, isolate him in his room, have dinner with him, and truly ask him about how does he see the future of possible coexistence between the Israelis and the Palestinians. If he says that he supports the two-state solution and denounced the Palestinian covenant, calling for the total destruction of that Zionism in Israel, we could just leave. If he says that he's going to continue, then we shoot him, we kill him, and then we go.
But are these
this
decisions
is counterfactual history?
I mean, it's counterfactual, but also, you can't know where history is going to go. I mean, from what you report in the book, it looks like we were this close to assassinating Mahmoud Abbas. Because he had a house in the vicinity, and it might have happened. And who knew that within a decade, I guess, or however long it was afterwards, that he would become the person who could have conceivably been considered a leader for advancing the Oslo Accords and peace, and possibly even after he became Palestinian president. So what would have happened then? I mean, how can we know? Aren't we taking a huge political risk by assassinating people who might later become valuable leaders?
Israel has assassinated 3 kinds of individuals. One are terrorists, second are proliferators and scientists dealing with weapon of mass destruction projects, and the third is leaders. The third one is the smallest of all. And I think that one of the reasons is that Israeli leaders were very, very cautious not to call for the assassination of another leader because that would legitimize assassinating Israeli leaders. And a second reason, because of course leaders are usually kept under close guard. And third is that you do not know what sort of shift or turn the history will take. And as you say, history teaches us that in many, many cases, history does change after the assassination of a leader. You just don't know how it's going to change. In February 14, 1992, Israel killed Abbas Musawi, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, because he was involved in terrorist activities against Israel, and there was a window of opportunity to kill him in South Lebanon. So by itself, you could see this as a legitimate operation, but he was succeeded by Hassan Nasrallah, who was by far more radical, efficient, and lethal from the point of view of Israel.
I mean, you point out something very similar about the assassination of Sheikh Ahmed Yassin from Hamas. You know, it was Israel's sort of glory that it managed to take out the spiritual leader of Hamas, but you also point out that it opened the way for a closer relationship between Hamas and Iran.
Yeah.
So what are the long-term consequences? I mean, you may have short-term satisfaction in killing a terrorist, but what about the long-term political consequences?
I think if there are a few lessons that can be drawn from the book, and that indeed killing a leader is very problematic because you don't know where history is going to go after that. But when assassination is part of an overall policy that has different pillars, when it is done systematically, and not just in order to satisfy the need or the mood, the gloomy mood of Israelis that were hit by terrorists and they want to feel that the government is doing something. And when assassinations or targeted killing are aimed at the operational level, whoever they are, in which country they are, the lesson is that it might work and might change the picture or the rules of the game for the benefit of Israel. One example is the series of assassination after the Munich Olympic, that unlike what portrayed in movies and books, Israel didn't kill the perpetrators of Munich. They didn't hit them. They didn't reach them. They stayed alive. This is not the Hollywood scenes.
Yeah, we all saw Munich. Come on.
Yeah,
So it's all wrong?
Munich is a great movie, only it doesn't have 1% of truth. It's just not true. There were some
news.
Palestinians who got killed by Israel. This is true. This is following Munich. But all the rest, if someone knows Mossad, I asked Mike Harari, who was the chief of special operations from Mossad and in charge of assassination at that time. I said, "Did you see Munich?" He said, "Yes." I said, "What was your reaction?" He said, "I cannot tell you because I fell asleep."
Let me go back. I want to ask you something about the relationship with the U.S., which is, of course, really sort of critical to understanding Israeli intelligence history, is this intelligence sharing with the U.S. I wonder if this policy of targeted assassinations inspired the U.S. or other countries. And I'm thinking particularly that Israel was developing these tactics back in the 50s already. And in 1960, the CIA was part of a plot, didn't actually do it, but part of a plot to kill Patrice Lumumba of Congo through poisoned toothpaste. Now, that sounds familiar because I read it in your book. Do you think that these countries learn from each other and that other countries have tried to adopt Israel's tactics, especially those who are sharing intelligence information with Israel, like the U.S.?
Well, I'm not sure that in the 60s the CIA needed the technology of Mossad. I think that back then they were much more advanced and Israel maybe learned from them, not on assassination, but generally on signal intelligence and visual intelligence. But countries usually do not share these operations. This is
even Israel and the U.S.
Even Israel and the U.S. I asked Michael Hayden, the legendary chief of the NSA and the CIA, probably the most important person in the history of American intelligence the last decades. And I said, General Hayden, we met in Washington. I said, General Hayden, of all the different means that were used against the Iranian nuclear project, economic boycott, the prevention of export of dual-use equipment, political pressure, Stuxnet, the malware that was implanted inside the Iranian nuclear project, computers, etc. What was the one thing that you can point out that was of the greatest value? He answered without hesitation. The one thing that delayed the most was that someone was starting to kill their scientists. It was not us, he said. It's illegal according to American law. I don't know who did that. Well, I assume
Didn't
that
he wink when he said that?
Yeah, well, he smiled. I assume that he has a guess. And when I smiled, he said, well, don't you get me wrong. The Israelis never told us anything about that. But of all things, this is what affected the continuous delay of their success to develop a nuclear bomb from any other thing. And he recalled one of the National Security Council meetings, one of the first with Obama. When Obama asked him how much uranium is in Natanz, one of the enrichment facilities in Iran, he says, Mr. President, I actually have the answer to this question. which I'm going to tell you in a minute. But, Mr. President, it doesn't matter because there's not going to be a bomb coming from what happens in Natanz. What they're building in Natanz is knowledge. And the only way to damage knowledge is, of course, to hurt the scientists.
I have to say that when, reading the book, I face this terrible contradiction of being both sort of horrified by what is essentially a bloodbath, right? An ongoing bloodbath, but also swept away in the storytelling, right? It sort of feels like somewhere between James Bond, an episode of Fauda, with an element of Second Life because I felt like I was doing it myself. Do you feel like this, in a way, could glorify the whole issue of targeted killings and maybe even make people kind of excited about it? And does that concern you?
I think that everyone can take the book wherever he or she want to take it. And
I wasn't trying to take it that way.
Yeah, of course. No, I knew that this is, I would say, a charged topic, very delicate, very touchy in many countries.
Probably in this one too.
In Israel as well, and the US as well. Of course, for example, in Germany, just speaking about targeted killing in Germany, we were making a documentary for German TV, which is going to be aired soon, about that affair of the German scientist going to work in Egypt. And we met with the guy who made the parcel bombs that were sent to the scientists in Egypt. And that guy, after explaining in details how he made the letter bombs, he says, Ronen, his name is Nathan Rothberg, he said, Ronen, please ask me, what does a person like me need? It's like, what sort of characteristics? What sort of abilities? I said, yes, you need to like explosives. He was the man in charge of the demolition lab, special operation demolition lab of the military intelligence. He said, yes, but what else? I said, I don't know. He said, person like me need to know how to forgive. I said, forgive? Like forgive who? Even terrorists? He said, yes. Even, I asked, even mega terrorists, Osama bin Laden? He said, no. There are these terrorists that are so important and so vicious that only God has the authority to forgive. My job was to arrange the meeting.
The meeting with God.
The meeting with God. And in my laboratory, I opened the bureau for arranging meetings with God. And then he says, Ronen, ask me how many meetings did I arrange? And I see that the German journalists sitting with me are horrified just from using that language. So I understand that the context is complicated and problematic. What I try to do when writing the book is just getting myself out of the scene. There is no first person, except for one place.
I can testify. There's no first person.
And I just took myself out, just describing and let the reader make her or his call on what she believed. There are two questions. When we deal with targeted assassination, there are two questions to be asked. And all the rest are just derivative of the same one. First, is it effective? Second, is it morally and legally justified? Is it effective? I think I can answer this from 8 years of research. Is it morally and legally justified? I think everyone has his own call to make.
Let's talk about Ronen Bergman. If you say the name Ronen Bergman in Israel, I think the first question on people's minds, and I tested this spontaneously when I told somebody about this interview, they said, how does he get his information? Can you tell us about the process of finding information for this book, much of which has never been revealed before?
I smile.
You are smiling. Our listeners can't see it, but trust me.
No, I smile to the interviews. It works.
Oh, that's how it works?
Yeah.
What about documents?
Smiling is an answer, but it's just part of the answer, of course. I think, look, everyone has his own motive. And I got 1,000 people to speak, most of them, fortunately for me, on the record. Are you sure you weren't in Unit 504?
No, he's not saying anything.
I did my military service with recruitment and running of live agents. And that gave me a lot of experience when coming to speak with sources as a journalist. There are many reasons why someone would speak. And also we have to bear in mind that these people, either politicians or intelligence officers, are the masters of manipulation. And so apparently some of them try to manipulate me as well. And you can ask with all good reason, so how do you know that what you wrote is truth? I try to address the question of authenticity and reliability when interviewing many people and try to get as many documents as possible. And I'll get back to a question about documents. Some of the veterans of Israeli intelligence kept documents in their private possession. They forgot it upon retirement.
Isn't that violating every norm and protocol in the Army and Mossad and every other security agency?
Well, it might be so, but we also have to bear in mind that these organizations have violated the law bluntly for many, many years by opening private illegal archives, not transferring the material, which is our history. It's not their history. It's not their shop. It's the history of the Jewish people and the history of Israel. They did not transfer it to the state archive. They did not allow the chief of the state archive to visit their archive to make sure that they are not destroying what could be of embarrassment to them. And when I appealed to the Supreme Court, and I said, listen, all these archives, Mossad, Shin Bet, the Atomic Energy Committee, Military Intelligence, Ministry of Defense, they're all illegal. And they should have started declassifying all of the documents older than 50 years. That's the law. An amazing thing happened. They delayed the hearing, unfortunately, with the backing of court. And then they came to court, they admitted it, and they just changed the law. They declared all the archives legal in retrospect, and they prolonged the classification time from 50 to 70 years, older than the state itself. And one of the chiefs of Israeli intelligence said, Ronen, you shouldn't worry. When we reach 70, we'll prolong it to 100.
Amazing. Okay, final questions, because we have to wrap up. Now, this is really an obnoxious question because you say in the book very clearly why you can't discuss it. But I was a skeptic always about the conspiracy theories that Israel killed Yasser Arafat. And you can't discuss it. But you do discuss it in the book in a way. What can you tell us about it? I mean, you go through the long history of how Israel tried to kill him in the past, in previous decades. It sounds an awful lot like certain other assassinations that Israel has done with poison. What can you tell us?
There was a continuous debate what to do with Arafat. People advised the chief of staff, the deputy chief of staff, Dan Chalutz, thought he should be abducted from the Muqata, the headquarters in Ramallah, then put on an island. He even traced a few islands by Sudan, I think, with 2 assistants and a bag of food, and then that the world should be alert that he is there and take care of him.
I think you said it would be his new home.
His new home. There was another idea to post online an embarrassing video of him. Another idea that was partly conducted was to give the media some embarrassing material that was confiscated from the Muqata. And there were people who thought he should be killed. Now, these voices reached Washington. And President Bush, in a meeting with Ariel Sharon in April 2004, says, Mr. Prime Minister, I would like you to promise me that you're not going to kill Arafat. The Americans knew that Arafat is an unclosed circle from the point of view of Sharon, because Sharon was furious that he was saved in Beirut, and Sharon got the hit for this awful war and invasion in 1982. So the president tells Sharon, please promise me. And Sharon looks at President Bush and says, Mr. President, I see your point. So President Bush got it, and he said, okay, good, but please promise me. And Prime Minister Sharon says, Mr. President, I really understand what you're saying. So this ping pong goes on and on until Sharon promised him that he will not kill Arafat.
But then you later say he didn't feel bound by it afterwards.
And then Uri Dan, like a devoted, loyal spokesperson, said or wrote that he told him that from a certain point in time, he decided that he's not bound to that. And then Arafat got mysteriously ill. And Uri Dan says, Sharon will be written in history as the person who wiped out Arafat without actually killing him.
We'll have to just guess what that means. Let me ask you one final question. Your book sort of begins and ends with Meir Dagan, who was legendary in a way as the head of the Mossad. And it's interesting that by the end of the book, he has sort of shifted his perspective from previous years and no longer believes that only military force can lower violence and lower escalation and resolve the conflict, and he believes there must be a political and diplomatic solution. This is an increasing trend, it seems, among intelligence and security establishment. Do you think it's characteristic of people who live their lives in these situations to come to that conclusion? And why are they so at odds with the political establishment today?
Yes, and it's true for many of the people described in the book. And you just point out Meir Dagan, but also Ariel Sharon. Ariel Sharon, at the last year as being prime minister, before suffering the stroke, he came to the conclusion that there is no other solution but the two-state solution. And his top assistant, chief of staff, Dov Weizkla, says once he reached that conclusion, he didn't have any problem with turning his back on the settlers and the settlements. And he understood that they need to be disassembled, and he supported the two-state solution. And Dov Weizkla is convinced, there's no one more familiar with Sharon, he's convinced that if Sharon wouldn't suffer the stroke, he would make peace with the Palestinians. That's after Arafat was out of the way. But, and that goes back to your question about Dagan. Dagan decided that he stands against Netanyahu. because he was afraid that Netanyahu way leads us to the end of the Zionist dream, to a one-state solution, in an Arab majority, and to an apartheid regime and other things, awful things that he said. And he stood against Netanyahu in that rally in Tel Aviv and tried to convince the Israeli public not to vote for him in 2015 when the sign of cancer evident on his face. And Meir Dagan, the legendary assassin, started to cry on stage. And it didn't work. And in our last phone call, just before he died, he said, I was disappointed. I thought that I'm going to have a much bigger influence on the Israeli public. And I think this is his story, but also much of the story of the Israeli public. This long-time warmongers, generals that saw the world with a dagger between the teeth, as Sharon used to describe Dagan, changed their view and understood that force cannot solve everything, but it was too late because in the new Israel, their influence is much reduced. And even that almost all the top experts of the Shin Bet and the Mossad, Israeli military intelligence, all of them comes with, I would say, what is described in Israel as a liberal views. They support the two-state solution. Nowadays, with the new Israelis, more settlers, more right-wingers, under the influence of all those many years under the Netanyahu regime, they just do not influence. They have very little impact.
So I was promised that was the last question, but I just have to ask one more question. What do you think the response is going to be to this book? I mean, will this not look like you are revealing a mirror, a side of Israel that we don't want to see? And could you not be accused of, revealing terrible things about what the country's done over the years? Kind of like the way Breaking the Silence is accused of saying things that they've done and making the country very angry at them.
I'm a journalist and a historian. That's my work. If I would start to make this calculation of how this would be seen by that group or the other, then I would end up doing nothing or violating my ethics and belief. I think that having such a book just strengthens democracy and strengthens Israel because it gives the Israelis the ability to look in the mirror and say, this is what we have done. And more so, I got the very opposite responses from liberals in the US who just read the book and said, this is a justification for the use of targeted killing. Now, when you are attacked from both sides, I think it means that you're okay.
On that note, Dr. Ronen Bergman, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure. We've been talking about your new book, Rise and Kill First, which has just been published by Penguin Random House. And I want to also give a big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, to Itai Shelem, our producer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. We would also like to thank Peter Frey and Carrie Shapiro and the Romay Foundation, who made a very generous contribution to the Tel Aviv Review. In the meantime, don't forget to check our archive. There are over 400 interviews to keep you busy. Like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review, Ideas from Israel, and follow us on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.